It's been quite some time since I last featured an episode of Rivals in Beards and Cars, and this one's a long time coming because we've done a couple of Jag versus Maserati or Jag versus Aston showdowns, even Jag versus Jag within XK8 versus XKR, 4.2 versus 5 litre. So of course, if you're interested in those really specific showdowns, then definitely check those out as well. For this one though, it's a little bit more of an overview because we're going to be looking at basically all versions of the DB7, so supercharged straight 6, open top Volante version, and of course we will be talking about the V12 as well. And on the Jag side, you've got the 4 litre, XK8 form, open top form, XKR, and it's, as I said, kind of an overview to see, or at least to give you a bit of a head start before you start travelling around the country and test driving different cars, which one is probably the better choice for you, depending on what you want and expect from the car. And we're going to be touching on stuff like pricing, value, performance, and in my opinion at least, and of course from owners and people who have extensive experience with these, maybe even mechanics or service engineers, stuff like that, I would love to see and hear your thoughts as well below, because that would of course help potential owners to decide. Also, there are 5 things which I think are key advantages for the Jag, and 4 things which I think are key advantages to the Aston, and at least one of them is a very easy thing to overlook, but for the right kind of buyer, just this one thing alone could make all the difference, quite literally. The first thing, which is a pretty obvious advantage for the Jag, is always an advantage for the Jag in every single generation: price. You can get a really good Jag XK for a lower price than a high mileage Aston DB7. A DB7 for a good long while you couldn't even find really for under 20 grand here in the UK. Now you can occasionally see them for 12, 14, which really is a good rivaling price for the Jags. If you go in the form of the XK8 though, with the non-supercharged, especially 4 litre engine, some of the really early ones, I mean you can pay peanuts for those cars. I'm not going to say I'd recommend going for one of those, but if you're just looking for bog standard stuff and you're willing to take whatever happens as it comes, then the entry point, let's say, is definitely an advantage for the Jaguar. We're going to get more into the price advantage in a second though, because that's a 2-part thing. The second thing though moves over to the Aston side, and that is exotic status. Now this one's going to be a bit controversial, and it's very much down to personal preference, but I would argue that if you take away your own love for either car, imagine that you don't really care any more about one than the other, and you just see them drive past. For most people, most onlookers, both petrol heads and non-petrol heads, I would argue strongly in fact that the Aston makes more of an impression. It makes every time you drive it, every time you pull up, feel like a special occasion. Even in that original straight 6 form, it looks like more of a supercar. When the Jaguar approaches, it's a very good looking, iconic shape which has a hint of British muscle kind of wrapped up in a GT body. So to me, the exotic factor simply has to go to the Aston because it is a more exotic car. It's more exclusive, it's more expensive, and everything about it matches that level. Now where you could get into the weeds a little bit is whether or not that's actually an advantage, because of course that's all well and good for the wow factor, but there are some downsides in terms of living with the car. Servicing costs, part costs, all that kind of stuff in some cases can make the difference. So there's a yin and yang to that. Jumping back over to the Jag though, this is an interesting one because you might be surprised here. If you're not too familiar with either platform, for performance, I would have to also give it to the Jaguar, because if you compare the base straight 6 supercharged Aston with about 330 horsepower to the basic 4 litre V8 XK8 with about 300 horsepower, well, the Jag should have a disadvantage, and yet it really doesn't feel that way. Now, I'm sure if you were to compare a certain version of the Aston, which again I'm not going to spoil, we'll get to it later on, then it could well flip and feel totally the opposite. But from my experience, I have reviewed the straight 6 supercharged Aston, which you can see here in the video, and I've driven the V12, but unfortunately I didn't have the chance to review it, so I don't have any footage of that car. And the reason why I drove one is I was actually going to buy one, and although it was a super high miler, which I didn't end up going for, like really high miler, 160 plus thousand, it did give me a good overview of how the two cars feel and compare. And as far as, again, going back to the Jag, it just feels more responsive. The Jag, be it supercharged straight 6 or the big V12, it's silky smooth. It's a way smoother engine than the Jaguar. Both of them are, in fact. And the straight 6 is a shockingly enjoyable car for something that isn't particularly quick anymore by today's standards. Once you get into our territory though, well, simply put, to have over 400 horsepower in the Aston, you've got to go for the V12. Basically a 6 litre V12 naturally aspirated with 420 horses. Sounds like a great option, and it's certainly a very supercar-esque engine. Compare that to the equivalent Jag, which would be the XKR supercharged, or you could say an RS. You're looking at an updated form of 4.2 V8 supercharged up around 400, 420 120-ish horsepower. So you're getting the same horsepower, albeit from a supercharged engine, but from 4 cylinders less and from a significantly smaller engine, nearly 2 litres smaller, which is quite a big disadvantage, at least on the surface, for the Jag. And yet in reality, the Jag does feel quicker. And even in terms of cornering, although I really enjoy the handling, in particular on the straight 6 Aston, it's very smooth. It feels much more ironically like a Grand Tourer than the Jag, which in my opinion looks more like a Grand Tourer, and yet the Jag is definitely better through corners. The Jag feels like it's a bit stiffer, a bit more composed. It does more of what you want it to do as a performance car, whereas the Aston feels like it only really wants to be a long distance GT, and it doesn't really care too much about cornering. It's not bad through corners, but it feels a little bit more floaty, not quite as precise, and in V12 form I was actually quite surprised because it felt like it did not handle as well as the straight 6. And maybe the extra weight, ironically, actually felt more floaty on the road, but that could be a high mileage problem. You know, maybe it had suspension geometry issues or the tracking was out. Could be many things. That's the fact of it. That's how it felt to me. The next thing though, to go back to the Aston, is funnily enough those engines. To me, it's not just about how quick the car is, it's about how they feel. And of course it has to be how a car makes you feel first and foremost, because you're not going to be flooring it everywhere all the time, so it needs to be a car that you can enjoy at any speed. In terms of the Aston, well, it just is a more interesting option when it comes to an engine. A supercharged straight 6 sounds like a very British thing to do, and it's a very interesting choice of an engine. Then a big, nearly 6-litre V12 is a fascinating engine. It's one of the most affordable entry points into pretty much supercar ownership with a proper V12 engine. Then if you compare that to the Jag, well, the Jag has a very capable, really impressive, especially 4.2 engine. The 4 litres have a few more issues, and they're older, which doesn't help. It tends to be higher mileage, etc. But the V8 is more of what you'd expect. As I said, kind of British muscle, and it feels like a British muscle car. The advantage of that is it makes them more robust, simple, and affordable, but the Jag feels less exotic because of it. To jump back over to the Jag though, another advantage, this one could also be a bit controversial, is space. The Jag and the Aston are both very low slung and very, you could say squat in terms of their shape. They're fairly wide for their time, decently long vehicles, certainly when you consider their engines, they kind of have to be, but in terms of rear passenger room, well, let's be honest, neither of them are great on that front, so I'd say that neither of them are really proper 2+2s unless you've just got small kids in the back, but the Jag is probably a little bit better. For boot space, it's pretty much a wash between the two. They're both decent enough for most things, since you probably wouldn't be using it as a daily, but you could feasibly. In terms of headroom though, that was the key difference for me. The Jag is not great in my opinion for headroom anyway. It's one of the reasons why I personally prefer the later XK that I had, the X150, the aluminium shape, because the headroom is significantly better. In fact, all of the space is significantly better. In the case of the Aston though, it's even worse. The headroom is much more cramped if you are a taller driver. And in the Jag, I found myself a little bit cramped, whereas in the Aston, I felt like I had more of an actively bad lower back after driving it, which again, they're both not great, but I'd have to give it to the Jag on that one. The next point in favour of the Aston actually returns to the world of cost, because cost being higher isn't necessarily always a bad thing. And why I say that is, of course, because that means it keeps more value. Now, the Jag is, of course, a cheaper car to begin with, so in proportion, you could say the Jag keeps more value, but by today's standards, if you want a vehicle that is going to probably be more collectible over time, well, again, whether or not it's the better car is up for debate, but an Aston Martin badge will always go a long way. So I personally think that if you're looking for an investment and you find a really clean example, the Aston is probably a better bet for a future investment. If you actually want to drive it and use it, you won't care so much. The market already shows that the Aston keeps more value, because an Aston with well over 100,000 miles will still cost about the same as the equivalent Jag with tens of thousands less miles than that has. It does keep more of its value relative to the current market. The next one is a huge point in favour of the Jag, and in fact, as we've got coming up now, a couple of these are big swinging punches toward each other. This is a strong right hook to the jaw from the Jag, and then the Aston is going to respond with a strong left in a second, but the strong right from the Jag is maintenance. Living with a Jag is significantly easier and cheaper than an Aston Martin. Just like comparing, one of my favourites, a Maserati for example, compare that to the equivalent Jag, like an XJR or an XFR. The Jag is just a simpler car. It is still, of course, an expensive car to begin with, and certain things are expensive in some cases, but generally way more parts parts are way cheaper on a Jag, and you don't need anywhere near as much of a servicing specialist, let's say, to keep up a decent history. You could get it serviced by a specialist if you want to, but any competent mechanic can work on a Jag. With an Aston, because of the engine, especially the V12, everything's a lot harder to get to. When I spoke to the chap about potentially having his DB7, he said he serviced it twice a year, could also be a product of it being very high mileage. I think he said his yearly maintenance was something like $5,000, and that's on a really high mileage car, and of course he was doting on the vehicle, but still, that's the kind of area you're looking at, and you simply don't need to spend that much on a Jag. Aston stuff tends to cost more, especially once you get into the world of replacing body panels or interior pieces. They didn't make as many of them, I don't believe, if I recall correctly, and across the board, again, it's a downside of being the more exotic of the two. Maintenance and parts are categorically more expensive when it comes to Aston Martin ownership. But of course, to go back to the analogy of being a supercar, it kind of comes with the territory. And as I said, to counteract that strong right hook, the left back from the Aston Martin is the one that I alluded to way earlier on in this video, and this one is a strong hit from the Aston Martin, and one which a lot of people I think really overlook. There's a manual. You can buy the Aston Martin DB7 with a manual gearbox. You cannot buy a single version of the Jaguar XK8 or XKR with a manual. They never did it. Now you can buy a conversion kit, but now you're getting into the territory of just paying the equivalent amount of money to just buying the Aston in the first place with said manual gearbox. The changes in gearbox are also more notable. In the case of the Aston, initially had, I believe it was a 5-speed Getrag manual and a 4-speed, I think it was GM if I recall correctly, automatic, which would have been the one I was in with the straight 6. Then the later version had a ZF with, I believe it was an extra gear, the 5-speed auto rather than the 4, and a 6 manual instead of the 5, if I again recall correctly. In the case of the Jag, well, you've got what you've got, the straightforward auto, which works very well, but like I said, for a driver's car, if you really do want that more authentic manual sports car approach, really, more supercar, well, having the option of a manual is a pretty massive deal, and I would say that is a very strong counter to the maintenance of the Jag if you're the kind of person who really wants a manual. And as I said, I would give 5 advantages in particular to the Jag, so we are ending on that 5th advantage, and this is also one which definitely needs to be noted depending on how often you plan to use these cars and also what you plan to use them for. And I would argue there is a bit of a difference as well. Fuel. The Jag isn't the best thing in the world on fuel, but it is without question superior to the Aston Martin. From most sources that you'll find online, even with that 330 horsepower straight 6, you're looking at 25 to the gallon motorway, more like 20 or 18 in some cases on average. In the case of the Jag, well, again, speaking to my experience, I had the newer one, but still with the supercharged 420 horsepower V8, I used to average about 23 to the gallon out of it. That is simply superior from a car with a lot more power, a lot more torque, and of course in the case of the newer Jag, a lot more performance, but even if you compare it to the 4 litre or the 4.2 at the time, the Jag does have an advantage on fuel, and again, if you're going to use it as a long distance GT, that could make the difference for you. If you plan to try and daily these, which I did with mine, you can, and of course that's when you're going to notice a real difference, but the funny thing is, in the case of the Astons, it's one of the ways in which they really started to move away further and further from Jaguar. The 4 litre V8 is fine on fuel when it comes to the Jag, and the straight 6 is about what you'd expect for its era, but as soon as they introduced the V12, there was really no going back there, because Astons ever since have never even come close to Jag fuel economy. You can get over 30 to the gallon out of some of the new XKs and XKRs quite easily on the motorway. The Aston, well, especially in V12 form, you're looking at probably the mid-teens at best. So again, a very, very strong one in favour of the Jag. As I said, this argument goes back and forth in so many ways, and I think the most succinct way to describe it is to go back to what I said earlier on. In terms of which one is better for you, it really does depend on 2 things above all else. What do you intend to use the car for, and what kind of car experience are you looking for? If you're the kind of person who loves the idea of a British muscle car wrapped in an elegant GT body, which is more affordable to buy, more affordable to run, and more affordable to live with, then you will absolutely be happy with the Jag, and you'll probably never look back. If, on the other hand, you crave something more special, more rare, more exotic, undeniably so, with the option of a far more supercar-esque engine, you're willing to increase your servicing costs and your budget for the year, have not quite as good fuel economy, maybe use it as more of a show car or a special occasion kind of machine, or daily if you want to, as that high miler proves you certainly can, and you want that more special feel, then the Aston is probably for you. Both are very impressive cars, very enjoyable cars, and there is certainly plenty to love when it comes to either of them. Like I said, check out the other Showdowns if you haven't already. I compared the newer version to the Vantage and various other things as well, but that's it for this rival Showdown. I'll see you in future with more, and thanks for watching.